It's so interesting to me to consider how her absence sort of makes her feel more present. How when the teacher leaves, we can really kind of see how the teacher manifests in our practice, really understanding that relationship through its absence. And I think that that is definitely in the Zen tradition, where this fire is building in this intentional form, and we leave, or the teacher leaves. And it's really through going away that we can come back, or this feeling the absence of the teacher really kind of illuminates the presence. And I read this passage in this novel, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and I thought it was just so beautiful, and I wanted to share it with you all. Because I think in this theme of understanding the relationship of the teacher in our practice, there's this kind of interesting opportunity to explore where practice resides within us, or where that comes from. And so this novel is a lot about tennis. And so this passage is about tennis, but I think it has a lot to say about our Zen practice as well. But who can imagine this training serving its purpose, an experientialist and waste-exporting nation that's forgotten privation and hardship and the discipline which hardship teaches by requiring? A U.S. of modern A, where the state is not a team or a code, but a sort of sloppy intersection of desires and fears, where the only public consensus a boy must surrender to is the acknowledged primacy of straight line pursuing this flat and short-sighted idea of personal happiness. But then how does the surrender the personal individual wants to the larger state or beloved tree or something stuff work in a deliberately individual sport like competitive junior tennis, where it's just you versus one other guy? And then also, again, still what are these boundaries? If they're not baselines that contain and direct its infinite expansion inward, that makes tennis like chess on the run, beautiful and infinitely dense. The true opponent, the enfolding boundary, is the player himself. Always and only the self out there, on court, to be met, fought, brought to the table to hammer out terms. The competing boy on the net's other side, he is not the foe, he is more the partner in the dance. He is the what is the word, excuse, or occasion for meeting the self, as you are his occasion. Tennis's beauty's infinite roots are self-competitive. You compete with your own limits to transcend the self in imagination and execution. Disappear inside the game. Break through limits. Transcend. Improve. Win. Which is why tennis is an essentially tragic enterprise. To improve and grow as senior juniors with ambitions. You seek to vanquish and transcend the limited self, whose limits make the game possible in the first place. It is tragic and sad and chaotic and lovely. All life is the same. As citizens of the human state, the animating limits are within, to be killed and mourned over and over again. This game the players are all at, to learn, this infinite system of decisions and angles and lines. But one facet of the real gym, life's endless war against the self you cannot live without. But then is the battling and vanquishing the self the same as destroying yourself? Is that like saying life is pro-death? So what's the difference between tennis and suicide, life and death, the game and its own end? Maybe no different, except the chance to play. And I think this idea of individuality is, I think, a real question for us in this practice. And how really, I think what sets apart, in my experience, Zen from other religious traditions that I have been exposed to is there's less pretense that anyone can do this for you. I mean, when you come and you sit, no one can sit for you. No one can bring you here. And that's the practice. It's not something anybody can give you. And so I think that this is interesting to consider how collective this practice is as well. How much support we feel from one another. How without that reflection of the other, we can't really know ourselves. And that's, I think, something that Buddhism shares in common with many of the world's religions, is that it really takes two to be a Buddha. You don't see Buddha as yourself or understand yourself as Buddha, but you see Buddha in someone else, and through that you become Buddha. And so, like the teacher, we see teacher, and that allows us to locate that within ourselves and manifest that in our own life. So it's, I think, this interesting dance, this give and take between self and environment, self and other. So in Japan, there are the two main schools of Zen are Soto and Rinzai, and they are quite different. They're often sort of juxtaposed as samurai and farmer Zen, or fast and slow Zen. And so the Soto school is the farmer or the slow variety. And in Japan, the difference is actually less accentuated than I think it has been historically. And so a lot of people kind of think that those differences are kind of artificially maintained, but there's much overlap. But there are differences in the forms. And one of the differences is when there is Dokusan and Rinzai, the bell is rung and everybody gets up and stampedes to where the teacher is. And so it's this race to get to the front, which shows your devotion and willingness to learn. Which in Soto, there really is no bell, there is no stampeding. Here we write our names on a list and someone taps you on the shoulder. And I think in the Soto mentality, this running seems strange to us. Are people of, I think, the kind of temperament that comes into Soto. But this stampeding, I think, does have something to teach us. This open display, this display of our intention. Because in all of the Zen schools, there is this idea of sitting with your mind on fire. This is how intense our practice is. It doesn't look that way on the outside. But this is the Zen mind, is to be on fire, burning. And I think, like reading that passage, that burning is really our willingness to engage and meet ourselves. And I've been thinking about this word interface. I think it's sort of interesting to consider practice in light of this word, because we sort of interface with this mind of Zazen. It's sort of like Dogen Zenji's main question. If we're already realized, why must we practice? And he answers this question in Bendowa, and he says, we practice to realize awakening, because without practicing, there is no realization of it. And so it's this engagement with Zazen in our practice that we come to realize that it is limitless. Through that limit, this sort of perpetual paradoxical chain that I don't know if it ever ends, but to embrace it and to move further and further into it is to set fire to your life and to burn more brightly. It is to engage your own life. And I sort of wonder what else is there. And I think we all must find that thing that we engage and embrace the limits of and throw ourselves into so we can move beyond those limits and transcend. And like the word in the passage, it's so much imagination. We imagine our movement forward, and that so much allows the creation of it. It is this very engaged process. It's sort of like this, I don't know, considering Rinzai and their just innate intensity and their open display of this intensity. I think one of the ways, I think in the Soto school we do this, but we do it, I think, in a more subtle and indirect way. And I think one of the ways that we really display our intentionality and engage our practice and our teacher is through questions. And this is really the thing that I want to impart the most, is the necessity of the question. Because without engaging, without asking the question, there is no possibility of any answer. And in all reality, it's the question that really matters, because that's the engagement. And so, as our teacher is away, I definitely come in the spirit of a student speaking to students. But I invite you to explore this nature of question and the necessity for having a question. And that being the bridge that allows you to engage the teacher, both externally and internally. And what a waste it is not to have a question, to not be burning with one. That is so much the spirit of Wednesday evenings in these talks, is at the end it gives you that opportunity, that choice to move further into your relationship to your own understanding. And without pushing yourself, without having that external engagement, you are only limiting yourself. It's very sad. And I think so much of finding the question is locating the talk within your own life, how this relates to you. I think this is so much of finding the question, of making what is presented to you come alive in a way that resonates to you personally. And then putting that out into the world in the form of a question and seeing what comes back. So perhaps you have some questions.
In the spirit of this talk, I've heard, and I could be wrong, that in Rinzai, at the end of the talk from the teacher, they don't have a question and answer, period. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I don't know if it's true, but I guess it's not really part of the question. If it is true, that is interesting. I think these traditions are so old. It's not like someone thought them up, but they worked themselves through over time. And I think that longevity speaks to an innate sort of wholeness, because all of the parts are there because of the continuity of it. It's almost like evolution formed the thing more than some person trying to engineer something for some purpose. So I think in these traditions, everything gets manifested somehow, as is inevitably true. That's how the psyche works. I mean, everything comes up somehow. So this is interesting. I think that this is how we manifest it in this period. I'm sure that they engage it in some other way. If that answers your question.
Yeah. That's
I've always gotten the impression that Edo-san isn't necessarily asking for questions. She's asking for comments, promoting discussion, and questions can be or may not be a part of that.
This is your opportunity to be on fire. What a gift to your teacher. To engage at your level of understanding in the Dharma. It's your opportunity to share that.
But I think we also all progress at different levels and different styles as individuals. And so the questions may be perceived by you as you're being on fire, but I'm not sure the fire is always necessary. It may be a part of it, but not necessarily routine.
Well, then I challenge you, because I think it is. Because I think you're right that we are all at different levels and we all sort of interface in our own unique way. But I think a characteristic of life is that it's always growing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the nature of life itself. And if we aren't growing, I think in a very real way, we're dying.
I think we'll have to agree to disagree.
But by this growing, I mean engagement. I think this is the practice of Buddhism. Whether we engage that mind or not. This is life. Whether we are awake or not realizing our own awakeness. It's a choice. I think it's a choice that we make in every moment, to engage or to not engage. And I think questions, too, could come in many forms. Maybe they're not necessarily verbal, even. But I think we can see in one another when we are moving, when we're in motion, when we're putting ourselves into our activity, and when we're just being passive. This is not a passive practice, even though it looks like it so much most of the time.
I've never seen it as passive, and I think Edo-san's frequent statement of just live, be yourself, live, to me also means being involved, and just with the living, I think there's growth.
See, and from this question, we are now doing it. What a gift. I didn't say it would be easy. I think it's often conflictual. It doesn't always feel good. And that's part of it.
This concept of our minds being on fire, intensity, reminds me of a Neil Young phrase. It's better to burn out than rust.
Say it again, please.
Neil Young, the songwriter, musician, has a phrase in one of his songs, it's better to burn out than rust. And so with that metaphor of fire, I see in my mind a fire burning bright, it diminishes, and what's left are ashes. Oh, in the fire of our minds, when it's extinguished, what is left? Another way of asking that question is, how do we mindfully rekindle that fire, moment to moment, or day to day?
What is left is practice, which is what you had in the first place. It's not like you gained anything, but you lived. You met it. It's this, I think, this ongoing cycle that we are just condemned to repeat because we are alive. But to be alive, I think that that's variable. I mean, I do in some very real, meaningful way. You sort of, there's like some dial that we can turn. And I think, I'm not saying to just ramp it up all the time, but to engage your life as it is what we're talking about. Which it's weird that we all came together to sit, to be, and to talk about engaging our life. But as human beings, this is something that we're not very particularly good at. Because we're afraid so much of the time. Or maybe we are just in desire of wanting our life to be something else. Because I think this fire isn't some intention to arrive somewhere. More as it is a commitment to engage what is here already.
The fire then is not extinguished. It's a continuing process. That's what I'm hearing.
I think we experience it as extinguished. I think people burn out and they get tired and they come back.
What rekindles that fire? Where do we go to reestablish that fire?
That is the question. I don't know. I think that's the question no one can answer for you. I think that's the thing that no one can give. That you have to find. That's your job. That's why we ask the question. I think that's what maybe the function of the question is. It is our pursuit and our commitment to finding that thing which promotes our practice.
I have a basic question. What is the purpose of the practice, Zen practice?
That is the hardest question that has been asked this evening. In this tradition, we believe that the mind of realization is something that everyone already has. And so we practice to realize that awakening that just is innate in living. So it is this very, I think it's sort of counter to our culture because it sort of seems like we're trying to gain something, but it's more like uncovering. It's like it's sort of clouded over by our habitual thinking and our wanting to arrest the thing in the first place. But that learning to let go and just allow, it is, I think we do it because it makes us more humane. It makes us more present and available for the people in our lives. It makes us more vibrant and enjoyable to be around. I mean, all these things. It's that uncovering of possibility. Is that
Yes.